Hello and welcome to the Amika Plus enteral pump webinar by Connected Care at SickKids. Today's session provides information and education related to the Amika Plus enteral feeding pump. We are unable to assess competency of each individual attending this session. Please continue to work with your agency to explore opportunities for further development and application of skills. Please also continue to work with families you are supporting in applying these skills relevant to their child's care needs. There are no conflicts of interest to disclose for today's webinar.
So learning outcomes, by the end of the webinar, you will have the following outcomes that you will achieve. One being to identify the layout and components of the Amika feeding system, demonstrate how to install and prime a feeding set, demonstrate how to deliver a bolus and continuous feed using the Amika Plus enteral pump, and then also identify common alarms and troubleshooting strategies. Lastly, we'll provide you with some resources at the end to support the use of the Amika Plus feeding system as well. So just for some background, there are some children in the community that live with enteral feeding tubes, and they're really dependent on the enteral feeding. So these enteral tubes can include the nasogastric tube, gastrostomy, and gastrojejunectomy tubes. Enteral feeding is essentially a method to provide nutrition and hydration directly into the stomach and to the intestines. And so the children, some children are dependent on enteral feeding just because there may be instances where children are not able to swallow or eat safely, and so they require an enteral feeding through their enteral tube. In order for their enteral feedings to go through the enteral tube may require a feeding pump. And so these feeding pumps are available for purchase by select vendors and or may be loaned by families on a short-term basis from Ontario Health at Home. What is Amika Plus? Amika Plus is a feeding pump used for enteral feeding only. So it has been recently introduced to Canada, and the main vendors that provide the Amika Plus pump is Kalia Pharmacy. And so now Ontario Health at Home has will be using this Amika Plus enteral feeding pump as a primary pump. However, in certain regions, so there are different regions that may use other enteral feeding pumps, really depending on which vendors are being used by the regions. One thing that you may have noticed with the Amika Plus pump is essentially there are no words used on the pump screen. So mainly the pump uses a lot of icons, a lot of drawings and images. And so it can be ideal for families who may not speak or understand the English language. One important thing to really highlight is that this pump is not to be used for the following. So to not be used for intravenous administration of infusion fluids, if enteral feeding is contraindicated by medical prescription, should not be used with premature patients born less than 37 weeks of pregnancy, and then also neonates who are at the age of less than a month. To also not to be used in MRI environments, including in ambulances, helicopters, aircrafts, and hyperbaric chambers. And lastly, this pump should not be used in areas where there is a risk of explosion. All right, so just to cover up the components of the Amika Plus feeding system, one is primarily the Amika Plus pump here. And the second is the smart holder that comes with the pump. So essentially the smart holder should be mounted onto like a pole. So this can be mounted on a feeding pole, an IV pole, or even a pole on the wheelchair. But we want to make sure that this is firmly placed on the pole. And how to do that is by this back piece right here, where you can loosen and tighten up the clamp to have it mounted on the pole. Another thing to note with the clamp is that it can be rotatable. So it can be rotatable as needed to just be adjusted in position. Another thing with the smart holder is that it can be placed either vertically or horizontally to however position you need the pump to be. Another thing as well is that on the smart holder, we have here the AC adapter right here, and this is where the power cable gets connected to. So at one end of the power cable, it gets connected to the AC adapter, and then the other end will be connected to the wall outlet. So this smart holder is essentially the power main power supply for the pump. So for the pump to be charged, it has to be docked or attached to the smart holder. This pump will not be charged without the smart holder. So this is a really important key, but also it needs to be attached to the power cable as well. To dock the pump on the smart holder is essentially you would get your smart holder and you will grab your Amika Plus pump here. And how to dock it is you would slide this in to the smart holder until you hear a click. And I'm hoping you heard that click. But there is a click that you would hear, and that really docks it in place. And just to really highlight it, that the Amika Plus pump will not charge or gain battery unless if it's attached to the smart holder. So really important to attach your pump to the smart holder for it to start charging, in addition to have the power cable as well connected to the appropriate places. All right. So that's essentially the Amika Plus pump attached to the smart holder. To disconnect, on the side here is a gray piece. And so you would just press on this gray piece like here. It's really hard to show, but we're going to press on this gray piece and slide it off. So essentially you just slide it off, and that's how you undock the Amika Plus. And then whenever you need the Amika Plus pump to be docked onto the smart holder, you essentially just place it like this on top, slide it down until you hear a click. All right. Essentially the pump can also function without the smart holder, but for it to be charged, it needs to be connected to the smart holder. Along with the pump and the smart holder, there will be an instruction book that will come with the pump set. This instruction book is also a quick reference guide. So it's a helpful tool to really reference to if you have any questions with the settings, the icons, the functions, and also some common alarms that may appear on the feeding pump. So this is really a helpful tool. This tool can be found on the manufacturer's website, including that there is a link at the end that will be shared to you. You can also use that online link as well. Lastly, we have our Amika feeding set. So this is the feeding set right here. We have here the container right here, which holds the formula as per the child's plan and orders. Essentially, you'll put in whether the type of feed and the amount of volume. The top of the container that holds the feed is a cap or this opener here, which essentially you just open it to pour in the feed and then close it once done. Then we have here the tubing line. Essentially, this is already pre-connected, but it is a tubing from the feeding bag that then gets connected to the patient's feeding tube. Starting from the top, right just below the feeding bag is a drip chamber. So this right here is our drip chamber. Moving along with the tubing, we then have the clamp right here, which we can just open and close. This is our clamp. And moving along at the end here is this connector piece, which then gets connected to the child's feeding tube. This connector piece would not be able to be fit into an on-fit feeding tube. So majority of the children that are in the community have a on-fit type of feeding tube. And so for this piece, for this feeding set to be connected to the child's feeding tube, essentially you will just remove this connector piece like so by just untwisting it. And now this piece can be attached to an on-fit type of feeding tube. So then you just twist it on like so. So now this can be used for an on-fit type of feeding tube. Likewise, if it's a non-on-fit feeding tube, so if it's a feeding tube that is not an on-fit, you just get the connector piece and connect it back into place. And now you can use this to have it compatible with a non-on-fit feeding tube. This image is essentially a overview of the setup. So the setup with the Amika Plus pump and the feeding set to the patient's feeding tube. One important thing to really highlight is that the Amika Plus feeding set is to be used with Amika Plus pump only. So not to be used to administer gravity feeds. We did have this question before, as this feeding bag does kind of appear like to be a gravity feed bag, but the Amika Plus feeding set should not be used to administer gravity feeds. All right, and so prior to starting a feed through an enteral pump, we want to confirm the prescribed feeding and or hydration plan for the child. So this would include the type of feed, whether that's a blenderized diet, formula, fluids, the frequency and timing of the feed. So whether that be like a continuous feed or a bolus feed, or even a set scheduled time every 4 hours or so. And lastly, you want to confirm the volume to feed and also the rate of the feed as well.
Alrighty, so now we're going to go more into a demo of the Amika Plus pump. So to begin, we'll have our feeding set. When we're ready to feed our child or our client, we want to ensure that the clamp on the tube or the tubing is closed. When it comes out of the package, at first, the clamp will be open. Okay, so make sure that that clamp is nice and closed. You can hear that click as well. And then, like Disney mentioned, as per our orders, we want to put the appropriate volume and type of formula in the bag. For this demo, I'm just going to use sterile water for now. Okay. So if the clamp was unclamped, you would soon find formula all over your feet or the table. So that's why it's super important to clamp it. So we'll close the lid. Okay, and then we have our drip chamber here. We're going to want to squeeze this 1 to 2 times gently until it's about half full. Okay, now we're going to demonstrate how to install into the pump. Okay, can I ask you about that, please? Yeah, for sure. So for the demo purpose, I'm going to disconnect this pump from the smart holder, but it can also be used to feed the child with the smart holder on. So we're going to open the door on the Amika pump using this lever right here. And that will expose our pathway for our tubing, okay? The purple clamp that is on our tubing is going to sit in this hole here. And there's 2 sides to the clamp. There is a smooth side, and there's a side that has the actual clamp on it. So the smooth side of the clamp is what goes into the Amika feeding pump. I'll show here. The smooth side, and a tip is to insert it at a 30-degree angle so that it helps to click. And then you'll hear a click as well. Then take the rest of the tubing and make sure that it's in, whoops, pop that back in. It's in the pathway so that it's not getting kinked here when we close the door. To close the door, you're going to press and hold and then push that lever down once again. And now we can turn our pump on. So to turn our pump on, we'll press the on-off button, press and hold. Great. And so for our priming, I just want to emphasize that we are going to be disconnected from our patient's enteral tube. So the distal end, we don't want to be priming fast, large volumes of feed into the child's feeding tube. And the last part that we'll talk about is cleaning the pump. So if routinely, we want to clean it about once a week, but if it is soiled, if milk gets on it, for example, or anything like that, then we can use a ready-to-use wipe and simply clean the exterior of it. Do not put the pump under any type of running water itself. When we do clean the pump, we want to make sure that it is off and it's disconnected from the smart holder. And the door itself can actually be removed. So you know you didn't break the pump, it's intentional. And that way it allows for a more effective clean in all of the grooves of the pump. And then it can be reattached as such. Okay. Important to know that once it's clean, we want to leave it to fully dry for about 5 minutes before we turn it on or reconnect it to a power supply.
I'm just wondering, is this clamp adjustable? Like you can you adjust it or slide it up or down?
Excellent question. You absolutely can. And that affords you the ability to, depending on the height of the pump, if you need more length above it or below it to reach the child's tube, then it does not matter where. It can be slid up or down the tubing. Okay, so after some time, if you don't press anything, the screen will dim. So then that way, if I just press one of the buttons, it'll show up. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how to prime the pump. So we've installed it, and now we're going to press our prime button, which is these three lines here. And then there's two functions that we can use to prime this pump. It is the automatic and then the semi-automatic. So I'll have Disney move to the next slide as well so that we can see that. Great. So for a semi-automatic priming, we will press the button on the far right, press OK, and as you can see here, the pump is priming itself. So the progress bar is going nice and slowly, and you can hear and also see that the pump is priming the formula through. Again, we're going to be disconnected from the patient when this is happening. Okay. I'll stop it now just for time purposes, but once it gets to the bottom, you'd press OK. Another option we can do is our press and hold. So going back to our prime button, instead of automatic, which we've pressed here, I'm going to choose semi-automatic, which is down here. So this function means that I have to press and hold in order to prime my line, which I'll demonstrate now. And then I can visually see once the formula has reached the end of the feeding set that it's been adequately primed. Great. And then once I'm satisfied, I can press OK. And something to mention is you can prime the feeding set by gravity before installing it into the door. So there are three ways: by gravity, semi-automatic, or automatic. Great. So now we'll demonstrate how to start a feed. We're going to find ourselves at the menu button at the top here. And the key thing with the Amika pump is understanding these symbols. So as Disney mentioned, many of the symbols and their definitions can be found in the quick reference guide, which is also available online, but I'll explain this one to you. So we've clicked menu, and our first menu option is bolus versus continuous. So that's straight line, meaning continuous, or this up and down line, which is bolus. So I'd like to click this menu. To click this menu into it, I'll press OK. And now I'm faced with bolus, which is this up and down line, or continuous. So for the purpose of this demo, I will be showing a continuous feed. And the second line here shows a V with a target, and that stands for a target volume. So I'm going to be demonstrating how to feed on continuous mode with a target volume. Now, I will say that a majority of children will use continuous mode with a target volume, which allows us to program a rate and a set volume. There is bolus mode available on the Amika pump. Essentially, bolus mode allows you to set a volume and rate as well as an interval between boluses. And this is ideal for when a child is continuously attached to their feeding pump. But by feeding on continuous mode with a target volume, we can feed once, disconnect from the patient, and then reconnect them at their next bolus feed time. Okay, so continuous with a target volume I'm content with, so I'll press OK. And then it takes me back to my home screen. So now I need to put in my rate as well as my volume. So for this demo, I'll put my rate as, let's say, 150. So I'm going to use this plus button here. I'm going to press and hold until I reach my 150. Here we go. And now I'm going to put in my volume. So I'll use these arrows to adjust that. So let's say my volume is 100 mils. Oops. And then I went too high, so then I would just press and hold the minus button. Okay, so then I do my check before I start. So I have my 150 mils, 150 mils an hour for 100 mils. It'll actually calculate how much time it'll take based on these two values. So it'll take 39 minutes based on what I've started. At this point, I will attach to the child's enteral tube. Okay, to start the feed, I'll press start. And I know that the feed is running because you'll be able to hear it and see these 3 water drop molecules on the screen that are moving. Okay. If for some reason I wanted to stop the feed while it's running, I can press the red stop button. And then once I've pressed that, I know the feed is stopped because this stop symbol, which matches that button, has now appeared. And then to resume the feed, I'll press start. Okay. We also, along the bottom of the screen, have what we call a progress bar. So I can tell right now it says 2 mils out of 100. So that means 2 mils of formula have been delivered out of the 100 mils. So that tells us how far we are into the feed. In terms of feeding bags, Connected Care recommends enteral feeding bags can be used up to 1 week if they are functioning well. So that is contingent upon, before each use, making sure that you're visually inspecting the feeding bags and making sure that they're not defected or soiled. After each use of a feeding bag, you'll want to rinse it, so with water, and then wash it out with 1 or 2 drops of soap and water. You can also use 1 part vinegar or 1 part water. Rinse it out, get all those soapy bubbles out or vinegar, and then allow it to air dry before the next feed.
So moving forward, we'll be discussing about alarms and information signals. So the Amika Feeding Plus will send messages to let us be aware in the form of alarms and information signals. So there's a different combination of how the Amika Plus feeding pump will send these messages. And so one would be a flashing or fixed LED light on the top corner, and it will highlight in the color of yellow or red. These alarms do come in different priorities. So one is low, medium, and high priority alarm. So for a low or medium priority alarm will be blinking in a yellow flashing light. And if it's a high priority alarm, that will be a red colored flashing light. Another way for the Amika Plus pump would be alarming is through the alarm beep sounds, which is emitted by the pump. In addition, there will be an alarm symbol in a icon that appears to be like a bell. And that will be on the top of the pump screen, which we call it the status bar. And so in the image, you can see that there is a bell on the pump screen, just on the side corner, and that will be flashing when there is an alarm symbol. Then there will also be a drawing or an image that indicates the alarm type or the alarm condition. And that will be appearing on the pump screen when there is an alarm. First thing first, when the Amika Plus pump is alarming or sending us some information signals, we can acknowledge the alarm by muting the alarm. And so there is a picture at the top of the pump. Okay. There is a symbol at the top of the pump that appears to be like a bell with a cross symbol over that bell. And that function really helps to mute the alarm. So you can acknowledge the alarm by muting the alarm and clicking on this button. When there is an alarm condition existing, even when you press the mute button, the light will still be flashing because that alarm condition is still existing. Once you mute the alarm, it will mute the alarm for approximately 2 minutes. And you'll see on the screen that the symbol of the bell is with the cross, so that means that it has been muted. And of course, you're going to then move forward and look at the alarm type that's displayed or appears on the pump screen. So depending on the drawing that's depicted on the pump screen, you're going to address the issue and really try to make the corrective action as indicated on the pump screen. So these drawings that appear on the pump screen display the type of alarm type, and essentially it's telling you where to really address the situation. And according to that picture, you're just going to make the corrective action that probably was causing the alarm. Once I make the corrective action, I'm just going to cancel and release that alarm by pressing on this stop red button. And then once I cancel the alarm and after making the corrective action, I'm going to then resume the feeding or continue the feeding by pressing on this green start button. And then you'll see that there is those drops, and that's telling me that the feed has been resumed. Okay, going back to the presentation slides, so the first two images show an occlusion alarm. So it's really the pump is telling us that something is just not right in the pathway of this pump set. So when the first picture shows an upstream occlusion alarm. So when you look at the image, you see that there is a cautionary sign. In addition, a X mark that's placed between the feeding bag and then also the pump. So the upstream occlusion alarm is indicating that there is perhaps a kink or an obstruction that's causing this occlusion in the upstream. So that's between the feeding set and the pump. And so in this alarm, you're going to check the feeding set, making sure that the lines that are above the pump or in the pump are cleared from any kinks. And then from here, you can make the corrective actions and then resume the feeding. The next image is a downstream occlusion alarm. So in this image, you see, likewise in the first image, there's a cautionary sign, but then also the X mark, instead of it being between the feeding bag and the feeding pump, it's actually below the feeding pump. So the X mark is between the pump and then also between the patient's feeding tube. So here you're going to check if there's any kinks or any obstructions in the pump set here or anything below the pump directing into the child's feeding tube. And perhaps here you're going to maybe also try to clear the feeding tube as well. After you make the corrective actions by clearing everything, you're going to then resume the feeding. The next image here, looking at the first image, shows an empty bag or an air in set alarm. So you have here the cautionary symbol. In addition, that the feeding bag is now also highlighted more boldly. And so in this case, either the bag is empty or there is some kind of air in the line. And so you're going to check for any air bubbles, or perhaps if the bag is empty, is running dry or is empty, you can either top it up with the feed as needed. The next image shows a target volume reached alarm. So this essentially tells us that the volume has reached, and the pump is telling us whether we want to restart the feeding or end the feed. Then lastly, we have a empty battery alarm. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but it has a cautionary symbol in addition to a battery symbol. So this is telling us, hey, the pump is low in battery. It needs to be connected to the main supply for it to be charged. So that would be connecting the pump to the smart holder. And I think there was also a question on the chat box, but you're going to connect the Amika Plus to the smart holder, but then also have the power cables to the AC adapter at the end right here, and then to the wall outlet for the whole set to be charged. So without the power cable, the pump cannot be charged with just the smart holder. It needs the power cable to be also connected for it to be charged.
So, like Disney mentioned, one of the alarms can be a low battery alarm. So, that brings us to talk about battery life of the Amica Plus pump. So, depending on the rate, for example, rates above 100 or up to 125 mils an hour, a full battery will last 24 hours. For children feeding at higher rates, then a full battery lasts about 8 hours. And once the battery is fully depleted, it takes 6 hours to fully charge and get back up to its full state. So, with that being said, we highly recommend that overnight this pump is docked onto the smart set, and the smart set or the smart holder is plugged into AC power so that when the child wakes up and they're ambulatory, for example, or they're going to school with the pump or to a doctor's appointment with the pump, that the pump has a full battery.
Another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So is the smart holder serves as a battery as well?
Yes, it does, but it's not portable. So I wouldn't say it serves as the battery. I would say it serves as the charging platform. So we would dock the pump onto the smart holder, but this won't charge. The smart holder itself needs to be plugged in to AC power using the cord that comes with the pump. Another thing that we'll mention are the other menu options. So during the demonstration, I clicked menu and I discussed that first menu, which is feeding mode and settings, bolus or continuous. Again, going back to your quick reference guide will be key in determining what these symbols mean because the name of these symbols will not show up on the Amica pump. Okay, so we're in menu. This is the first one I talked about. To scroll the menu, we'll press this down button here. Okay, so that's night mode, this is sound, and then etc. And then you can use the quick reference guide to navigate these. To enter into one of these menu settings, we'll press the OK button. Where can you go to more facilitate your learning after today's webinar? There's a bunch of resources online. So on the manufacturer's website on amicaplus.ca, there are step-by-step videos and instruction documents, including the quick reference guide that we've mentioned multiple times today, where you can review, for example, and then there's also a virtual simulator. So if you just do a quick Google of Cabby Amica app, a website will pop up that allows you to do an interactive quiz where you can use your mouse cursor to actually program the pump based on the prompts that it tells you to. You can also partner with an agency educator or a clinical practice lead if you have access to one. And you can also use Connected Care Live. So for those of you that have not heard of Connected Care Live, it is a 24/7 web-based platform that is nurse-led. So nurses like Disneya and myself can be accessible through Connected Care Live. On our website, there is access to specialized pediatric resources that cover many technologies. And as well, you can access a nurse through talk, text, or video for help and to strengthen and support pediatric expertise among home care providers. So things like the G-tube is blocked or the G-tube has been dislodged, for example. Okay, if there's no further questions, then we'll end today's webinar. Thanks again for joining.